It was mid-April, swallow time in the West Country. At sunset, as Taka was crossing a shoal to deep water under an old ash tree, he stopped at the taint of hounds lying on the scour, pitted by their feet. Quietly he turned back to the water to swim sunken in the current, rising only to take in air. Round 2 bends he drifted, then landed and hearkened. An otter path lay across the next bend, and he followed it to the middle of the field, where he hesitated. Strange smells lay in the dew. He walked on, nosed the ground, and smelt man, where hobnailed boots had pressed the turf and crushed cigarette ends. He turned back, and would have gone straight to water if he had not heard the cry of a bitch otter at the far end of the path. "Hoo-ee-ick," he answered, and ran along to find her. Near the middle of the meadow he stopped as though he had trod on a gin. The taint of hounds lay thick with the scent of otter. Grasses were smeared with blood and spittle. His hair rose on his back. He blew through his open mouth, swung his head about as though looking for hounds, and was gone, silent as his low moon shadow. The river flowed darkly to the bend, where it broke shallow over the shillets that scattered the moonlight. Taka saw a movement at the tail of the shoal where an otter was listening. She ran to him and licked his face. Then she mewed and ran on alone to the riverside. It was White-tip. Taka followed her. She was draggled and miserable. She caught a trout and called him, but when he reached her she yickered and started to eat it herself. She mewed again and ran into the water, and following her, Taka returned to the scour opposite the ash-tree holt where that morning the hounds had plunged and bayed. All the way upstream she had been calling and searching under banks and on the beds of pools. At length she crawled onto the scour with something in her mouth and dropped it on the stones. She licked it from head to tail, and mewing again sank back into the water and returned with another, which she laid with the first found. Perhaps she could not count beyond 2. Perhaps White-tip had not known in her terror how many cubs had dropped in the water when the terrier had driven her out of her holt. The master had seen them sinking in the pool lit by a sun shaft, and hounds were whipped off. They drew on up the river and found the dog-otter, her mate, and killed him 3 hours later as he tried to cross a meadow to the wooded hillside. The old dog and White-tip had wandered together since Taka had been driven from her in the autumn. Her first litter had been born in January, when the river had frozen, and one day White-tip, returning to the holt, had found them gone. She had called them, seeking everywhere, and in pain, but she had found none to suckle, for a badger, walking on the ice, had dug them out with his long black claws and eaten them. White-tip's grief had been so keen that soon it had grown less, and she had lain with her mate in the bracken of Ferny Hill. And now White-tip was grieving again. For 2 nights as she travelled down the river with Taka she would cease hunting and run aimlessly on the banks, whining and searching. During the 3rd night she left him and returned to the ash-tree holt, wherein she had been making ready a couch of reed and grasses. Into the holt she carried a stone, laying it on the couch and licking it, until a sudden cry called her outside again. She traced the cry to a stone on the shallow, and brought it in her mouth to the holt. Soon the couch was filled with wet stones. Taka travelled on alone. He had gone under the last bridge above the tide, and the sun was rising when he crept out by a mud glidder and curled himself in a bed of green flags. Water ran clear and shallow on its rocky bed below the mud. Swallows flew to and fro across the river channel, winding deeper and broader through the meadows. A dark cloud arose over the crest of the oak wood, and the greenery of young leaves faded. Rain beat on the flags. A million drops in the river leapt to meet the drops fresh risen from the Atlantic. The cloud passed, and again the meadow was hot and bright. Beside the bridge grew an elderberry tree, straight and sturdy as a young oak in a park, one of the few soft-cored elderberry trees in the country of the 2 rivers that had not grown up a cripple of the winds. Its leaves partly hid a motor car, in whose closed body, shut away from the wind and the sun of the English spring, sat some men and women. They were awaiting hounds before moving to the parapet of the bridge, and perhaps, if a kill seemed certain and early, to the meadow over the low wooden fence. Other motor cars stopped on the bridge. The swallows, swooping over the stonework, saw the sunlight browned by the smoke of engines, and dived back again over the grass. The baying of hounds above the bridge became louder, for the otter had swum through the lower stickle and was travelling downstream. The hunted otter was White-tip. She had been chased for nearly 3 hours. Always the cries and tongues and legs had followed her, up the pools and down the pools, from holt to holding, from holding to shallow. "Tally-ho!" She saw faces and waving arms above the bridge, but she didn't turn back. Light-laden drops rolled down the green flags as their points drew down the sky. Taka lay still, watching. They rustled and broke with soft, sappy noises. White-tip was pressing the bed of flags. Her mouth was open. Taka, who had been listening for half an hour to the distant cries of men and hounds, stared at the movement. A sudden clamour ran down the river, loud and startling, for Deadlock had found White-tip's deep seals in the mud where she had crept out of the water. The two otters ran through the flags and slid down the mud to the river again. Taka spread himself in the shallow flow, moving with light touches of claws just above the rocks and stones of the bed. He moved slowly, as an eel moves, as smooth as the water, and with sinuous ease. Sometimes he crept out at the edge of the mud, walked a few yards, and slipped back into the water again. Hounds were crushing the flags around his bed, and throwing their tongues along his line. He swam through a long pool at his fastest pace, putting up his nostrils every 50 yards to breathe, and down again immediately. The tongue of Deadlock spoke across the river, and Taka trod through brown mud to a black ooze, in which he moved like an eel. The drain led under the tide wall to the glidder above the river. It led into darkness, with light coming through the chinks of a circular wooden trap that kept the tides back from the land. He sniffed at a chink and waited in the ooze. For 2 hours Taka lay behind the wooden trap. Then he stared up the river. A thin-drawn thread of sound in the air looped to another and another and another, loosed as 4 gossamers floating by in the wind. It was the recall to hounds. The horn-like voice of the huntsman as he talked to the hounds by name came to the otter through the chinks of the sodden elmwood trap. They trotted on the opposite bank, happy at the huntsman's heels, led home by aged Harper, who had taught them all to mark an otter. Flews to flews with him was Deadlock, and at his stern Blue Maid, old before her time, worn out by swimming. 20 paces behind the pack walked the master with 2 members of the hunt. He was saying that it had been a great day, only lacking a kill to complete it, when old Harper stopped and lifted his muzzle. The air on the water, colder than the land air, was brimming over the sea wall, and Harper had smelled an otter. Deadlock moved into the airstream, threw up his head, whispered, and ran down the grassy bank. 5 men waded the river, and Bitem, the terrier, was taken to the open end of the drain, where Tarka's deep seals in the lower ooze showed like big blackberries crushed in the mud. Bitem was given a pat on his ribs and gently shoved into the dark hole. He crept in, quick and shivering. The ooze sucked at Tarka's webs as he turned away from the light-stripped lid of the drain. He crawled in the ooze, away from the immense din, and saw an enemy coming towards him an instant before he smelled it. Iss! They met and joined and twisted into shapes smoothed by ooze. The terrier got a grip on the otter's rudder and hung on to it. Taka bit and bit and bit, quick as a striking viper, in cheek, shoulder, flank, nose and ear. Noises of bumping and squelching and snarling and tissing became louder when the trap was lifted and light showed the red and black shaking shapes. The otter's rudder near the opening was seized and pulled by a hand. Another hand gripped the terrier's scruff. The long, black, smooth shape was lugged out of the drain, the terrier fixed to it. Hounds were leaping and clamouring up at the men. A hand held Bitem's tail stump, another hand squeezed, trying to make him unclench. Taka writhed and contorted as he hung by his rudder. His back became a bow, suddenly bending up, and his teeth made a row of holes in a hand. The jerk made his rudder slip, and he dropped among the boots, to squirm between legs and away down the glidder. He pulled Bitem with him. Hounds trod on him, snarling and thrusting. Taka was hidden under their heads, picked up and thrown sideways, then dropped and picked up and shaken. 8 jaws held him at one time in the midst of a deep, sullen growling. He was hid in the plunging of white and brown and black bodies. He bit Deadlock through the flews and again in the nose as he was lifted on other muzzles. Bitem still joined to the base of his rudder. The pack bore him down to the tide where the worry broke up. Heads were lifted again and tongues thrown. Hounds stooped to water. Some swam after Captain, who was cutting the air with his knife-edge voice. But Taka was gone, and so was Bitem. The terrier came to the surface a minute later, 40 yards away, and swam inshore, spluttering and gasping, the short hairs of the otter's rudder still between his teeth. The tide was flooding fast in midstream. It carried with it sunken branches that sometimes showed a stick and turned under again. Taka passed them as he swam into a riband of water, returning under the steep and broken rock face that was the river's left bank. The riband moved down again, feeling the roots of oak trees and reclaiming the seaweed hung there since the morning ebb. The otter drifted to a root and rested his paws upon it, breathing through his mouth. 2 pink nicks above his nose welled red immediately. So did his paws. He bled also from rudder, back, neck, flank, and shoulder. While he was among the hounds, he had felt neither fear nor hurt, for the power of all his senses had been in movement to escape. Now his wounds smarted with the salt in the water, and he listened in a still dread for Deadlock's tongue. He lay still for a quarter of an hour. No hound spoke. The water rose and lifted him off the root and carried him away. He drifted through the mouse-hole pit and beyond the oak wood to the deeper winding bed in the meadow, where oarweed hung dry on the lower branches of thorns with sticks, grasses, sometimes a skeleton of a rabbit or bird. Dead brambles tangled in the thorns were swinging in the water, combing the scum of the tide. Cuckoo flowers grew above the top of the flood, their small, pale, gentle faces rising on tall stems from the dead stumps of trees, some broken and wilting, trodden into the mud and asleep again. That night Taka whistled in the creek, but heard no answer. Whitetip was not there. The flood tide took him 2 miles up the river again to the railway bridge. Taka walked under the road and climbed into a mill pond where 3 eels died. Travelling up the brook under the mazzard orchards growing on the northern slope of the valley, he reached a great hollow in the hillside, shut in with trees and luminous as the sky. Taka saw 2 moons, one above trees, the other level and in front of him, for the hollow was a flooded limestone quarry. Hoo-wee-yick! The sweet whistle, like the cry of the golden plover, only softer, echoed from the face of rock across the water. He swam down and could not touch bottom. The sides of the quarry dropped sheer down into the still depths, except at the far end, where was a little bay under a knuckle of land. Fish, big and slow-swimming, lived in the sombre waters of the pit, and Taka chased one down to mud 40 feet under the surface where it escaped. Hoo-wee-yick! The sky was growing grey. Taka could not catch a carp, and he was hungry. He went back to the brook. Hoo-wee-yick! Only his echo replied, and he wandered on. When the bees' feet shake the bells of the heather and the ruddy strings of the sap-stealing dodder are twined about the green spikes of the firs, it's summer-time on the commons. Exmoor is the high country of the winds, which are to the falcons and the hawks. clothed by whortleberry bushes and lichens and firs and moss trees in the goyles, which are to the foxes, the badgers, and the red deer, served by rain clouds and drained by rock-littered streams, which are to the otters. The moor knew the sun before it was bright, when it rolled red and ragged through the vapours of creation, not blindingly rayed like one of its own dandelions. The soil of the moor is of its own dead and scanty. The rains return to the lower ground, to the pasture and cornfields of the valleys, which are under the wind and the haunts of men. The moor is to the deer, the badgers, the foxes, the otters, the falcons, and the hawks, pitiless despoilers of rooted and blooded things which man has collected and set apart for himself. So they are killed. A tarn lies under 2 hills, draining water from a tussock-linked tract of bog called the Chains. The tarn is deep and brown and still, reflecting rushes and reeds at its sides, the sedges of the hills, and the sky over them. "Crock, crock, crock," said a raven, cocking an eye at the sky. Taka lay in the water and watched her picking up frog after frog and pouching them before she jumped off the bank and flew over the eastern hill. That evening Taka quitted the tarn and journeyed over the Chains to water that hastened in a bright thread out of the bog. It entered a narrow goyle, and the moon was hid by the hill before him. After a mile the water turned north under the hill whose worn grey feet it had broken for its bed. The goyle widened by the hoar oak, whose splintered stump, black as its shadow with the moon behind, glistered with the tracks of slugs. Near the hoar oak stood a sapling, caged from the teeth and horns of deer, a little tree by the grave of its father. And Taka went down the hoar oak water, which, under ridge and common, shattered the moon into shards and lost them under the trees which grew together in the lower valley. Its voice passed from leaf to leaf, up through the woods where badgers were seeking mice and black slugs, and to the night over the autumn hills. Where 2 waters met to seek the sea together, Taka walked over the trail of otters, and recognizing the scent of white-tip, he followed up the water the otter had travelled. Near the end of the night, while he was swimming in a pool scooped in the rock below a fall, he saw an otter shape before him. It moved slowly with the sway of waters, its head lolled on a stone. It had been drowned some hours. The whistles of otters playing at the fall during the previous night had been heard by the water owner, who had set a gin under the wash of the fall on a sunken ledge of rock where otters touched after the joyful pounding of the plunge. The otters had come back again. Iron in the water sinks, and however long cubs call her, a bitch otter cannot swim with 3 legs for ever. Taka heard the clink of the chain as the swollen body rolled, and his bubbles, blown of fear, rose behind him. At sunrise he had crossed 2 miles of woods and fields, stubble with lines of sheaves, stacked in 6s and tied in 4, fields of mangel and sweet turnip, where partridge crouched, and pasture given over to sheep, and found other water below Beggar's Roost Hill. Ducks were paddling by a farm as he walked upstream, passing under a bridge by which grew a monkey tree with leaves as sharp as magpies' beaks. Cottages by the waterside and a mill were left behind, and he came to quiet meadows where only robins were singing. He crossed from side to side, looking for a place to hide during the sunlight. Half a mile above the mill he found a rock in the left bank of the stream, with a wide opening half under water. Hazels grew on the bank above. Their leaves took on the golden green of spring in the beams of the low autumn sun, as Taka crept under the rock. He was awakened by the tremendous baying of hounds. He saw feet splashing in the shallow water, a row of noses and many flacking tongues. The entrance was too small for any head to enter. He crouched a yard away against the cold rock. The noise hurt the fine drums of his ear. "Go on, leave it! Go on, leave it! Deadlock! Harper, go on, leave it!" Then a pole was thrust into the holt and prodded about blindly. It slid out again. Taka saw boots and hands and the face of a terrier. A voice whispered, "Liu in there, Sammy! Liu in there!" A small, ragged brown animal crept out of the hands. Sammy smelled Taka, saw him, and began to sidle towards him. "Whoa, whoa, 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 whoa!" As the otter didn't move, the terrier crept nearer to him, yapping, with head stretched forward. After a minute, Taka could bear the irritating noises no more. Hissing with open mouth, he moved past the terrier, whose snarly yapping changed to a high-pitched yelping. The men on the opposite bank stood silent and still. No hound spoke, but the reason of the silence was not considered by Taka, who could not reason such things. The stream being narrow and shallow, the otter was given 4 minutes' law. 4 minutes after Taka had left, he heard behind him the short and long notes of the horn, and the huntsman crying amidst the tongues of the hounds, "Ho-la-la-la-la-lova! Get on to him! Ho-la-la-la-lova!" as the pack returned in full cry to the water, with Deadlock pushing through the pack to tell the way the otter had gone. As Taka was running over shillets with water scarcely deep enough to cover his rudder, Deadlock saw him, and with stiff stern ran straight at him. Taka quitted the water. The dead twigs and leaves at the hedge bottom crackled and rustled as he pushed through to the meadow. While he was running over the grass, he could hear the voice of Deadlock raging as the black and white hounds struggled through the hazel twigs and brambles and honeysuckle vines. He crossed 50 yards of meadow and ran down onto the tarred road. The surface burned his pads, but he ran on, and even when an immense crimson creature bore down upon him, he didn't go back into the meadow across which hounds were streaming. With a series of shudders, the crimson creature slowed to a standstill, while human figures got out of it and pointed. He ran under the motor coach and came out into brown sunshine, hearing above the shouts of men the clamour of hounds trying to scramble up the high bank and pulling each other down in their eagerness. He ran in the shade of the ditch, among bits of newspaper, banana and orange skins, cigarette ends and crushed chocolate boxes. He ran on for another 200 yards, then climbed the bank, pushed through dusty leaves and grasses and briars that would hold him, and down the sloping meadow to the stream. He splashed into the water and swam until rocks and boulders rose before him. Beggar's Roost Bridge was below. With hounds so near, Taka was heedless of the men that leaned over the stone parapet watching for him. They shouted, waved hats, and cheered the hounds. There were ducks above the bridge, quacking loudly as they left the stream and waddled to the yard, and when Taka came to where they had been, he left the water and ran after them. They beat their wings as they tried to fly from him, but he reached the file and scattered them, running through them and disappearing. Nearer and nearer came Deadlock, with Captain and Water Witch leading the pack. Huntsmen, whippers-in, and field were left behind, struggling through hedges and over banks. Hounds were bewildered when they reached the yard. They ran with noses to ground in puzzled excitement. All scent was gone. Hounds rolled in the dust or trotted up to the huntsmen, sniffing their pockets for food. Taka had run through a drain back to the stream, and now he rested in the water that carried him every moment nearer to the murmurous gloom of the glen below. While he was walking past the roots of a willow under the bank, he heard the yapping of the terrier. Sammy had crept through the drain and was looking out at the end, covered with black filth, and eagerly telling his big friends to follow him downstream. As he yapped, Deadlock threw his tongue. The stallion hound was below the drain and had refound the line where Taka had last touched the shillets. Taka saw him 10 yards away, and slipping back into the water, swam with all webs down the current, pushing from his nose a reem whose shadow beneath was an arrow of gold pointing down to the sea. Here sunlight was shut out by the oaks, and the roar of the first fall was beating back from the leaves. The current ran faster, narrowing into a race with twirls and hollows marking the sunken rocks. The roar grew louder in a drifting spray. Taka, with Deadlock still in pursuit, was carried to where a broad sunbeam came down through a break in the foliage and lit the mist above the fall. Taka went over in the heavy white folds of the torrent, and Deadlock was hurled over after him. They were lost in the churn and pressure of the pool until a small brown head appeared and gazed for its enemy in the broken honeycomb of foam. A black and white body uprolled beside it, and the head of the hound was thrust up as he tried to tread away from the current that would draw him under. Taka was master of whirlpools. They were his playthings. He rocked in the surge with delight. Then high above he heard the note of the horn. He yielded himself to the water and let it take him away down the gorge. Taka left Deadlock far behind. The hound was feeble and bruised and breathing harshly, his head battered and his sight dazed, but still following. Taka had gone under a bridge when Harper splashed into the water. The pack poured through the gap between the end of the parapet and the hillside earth, and their tongues rang under the bridge and down the walls of the houses built on the rock above the river. Between boulders and rocks, crusted with shellfish and shaggy with seaweed, past worm-channeled posts that marked the fairway for fishing boats at high water, the pack hunted the otter. Off each post a gull launched itself, cackling angrily as it looked down at the animals. Taka reached the sea. He walked slowly into the surge of a wavelet and sank away from the chop of old Harper's jaws just as Deadlock ran through the pack. Hounds swam beyond the lines of waves while people stood at the sea lap and watched the huntsman wading to his waist. It was said that the otter was dead beat and probably floating stiffly in the shallow water. After a few minutes the huntsman shook his head and withdrew the horn from his waistcoat. He filled his lungs and stopped his breath and was tightening his lips for the 4 long notes of the call-off when a brown head with hard eyes was thrust out of the water a yard from Deadlock. Taka stared into the hound's face and cried, "Ik-yang!" The head sank. Swimming under Deadlock, Taka bit onto the loose skin of the flues and pulled the hound's head underwater. Deadlock tried to twist round and crush the otter's skull in his jaws, but he struggled vainly. Bubbles blew out of his mouth. Soon he was choking. The hounds did not know what was happening. Deadlock's hind legs kicked the air weakly. The huntsman waded out and pulled him inshore, but Taka loosened his bite only when he needed new air in his lungs, and then he swam under and gripped Deadlock again. Only when hounds were upon him did Taka let go. He vanished in a wave. For a week he slept in the disused lime kiln on the greensward above the Head and Water that lost itself in a ridge of boulders above the tide wash. While he was exploring the fresh water, a storm broke over the moor, and the roaring, coloured spate returned him to the sea. He went westwards under the towering cliffs and waterfalls, in whose ferny sides he liked to rest by day. One night, squatting on a rock and eating a conger, the west wind brought him the scent of white-tip. At dawn he was swimming under the sea feet of the great hangman, and he followed the trail until sunrise was shimmering down the level sea and filling with aerial gold the clouds over the Welsh hills. On a rock below the white-walled tower of Bull Point Lighthouse, whose twin sirens were sending a warning to sailors far out beyond the dreadful rocks, Taka found again the trail of white-tip and whistled with joy. At half-tide, old Nog flew to the 7th hurdle up from the western row, where, unless gorged or in love or disturbed by man, he perched a while during every ebb tide. He stood swaying and sinuating his neck. The grip of his toes was not so strong as it had been in his early tree-top life. While he was trying to stand still before jumping to the rim of the sandbank awash below him, a salmon leapt in the lagoon, gleaming and curved, and fell back with a thwack on the water. Old Nog screamed and fell off the hurdle. He walked along under the hurdles, watching the water. The salmon was many times old Nog's weight, but it was a fish, and old Nog was a fisher.